welcome again. As the end of 2023 approaches, it's appropriate, before taking a break of a few weeks to enjoy the traditional festive season, to summarise the most important aspects of these discussions of the past 22 months. At the top of the list, because all other factors depend on it, is the establishment of moral principles for one's actions. Without this, one's life becomes analogous to a rudderless ship, driven by every whim of circumstance and expediency, in directions which constantly vary and hardly ever lead to a satisfactory goal or destination. This is why the common law precepts of doing no harm, causing no loss, committing no fraud, and keeping the peace evolved. Everyone instinctively knows that breaking any of these natural laws causes grief to the victims. Such concepts don't need to be written down, everyone already knows them. From the very early age when they both discover and are taught by parents or guardians that we must treat others as we wish to be treated, because in essence we are all equal. What we like and dislike, speaking of social interactions, not preferences of personal taste, others also like and dislike, and the reasons are obvious. It's because although we may vary and differ greatly in appearances, we're all basically the same. Sentient beings with the faculties life provides for enjoyment and suffering, including for most people, a cognitive ability, empathy for our fellow beings, and a conscience which tells us when we are supporting or infringing our fellows' natural rights and liberties. Normally, that awareness also tells us when our own rights and liberties are being offended against, does it not? However, it is apparent that in today's world, vast numbers of people have been deceived about this latter concept. Everywhere we look, even in our so-called free world countries, almost everyone is quietly accepting of a continuous daily abuse of their individual rights and freedoms, which in reality exist under natural law. Only a few examples of basic infringements illustrate the point. Take freedom of expression. Nowadays, it's possible to have the police knock on one's door to inform one that it's been brought to their attention that something one has said, either verbally or via public media, is contrary to some other person or person's opinions or diktat, and that unless one's thinking and expression are brought into line with these preferences of those others, that we face penalisation under some concocted legal process. Or what about the innate freedom to travel wherever one wishes, subject of course to respecting the property rights of others? For many decades now, to travel in a motor vehicle has required that we register ourselves and that vehicle with some allegedly official body, and also purchase a licence to operate the same. Granted that with vehicles now numbering in the millions in most countries, and that accidents will inevitably occur, some method must exist to identify vehicles involved in such incidents, otherwise there would be even more instances of hit-and-run events. That still leaves a number of questions unanswered. What should be the cost of this registration process, if any? And ought it to be publicly funded, instead of being the profit-making attribute of a private corporation? And if the latter, how is it to be determined? Just who are going to be the beneficiaries of this system, and who are the victims who must always pay? Those two examples are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. It leads us back to the question of the establishment of moral principles. In 1215, the English-speaking world was fortunate or blessed to have these principles enshrined in law with the sealing of Magna Carta at Runnymede. Most of that document related to administrative functions of various state officials or boroughs, but several of the clauses defined clearly that all members of the community are equal before the law, and that no one individual or group was lawfully entitled to assume command or authority over another. The relevant sections are the original unadulterated Article 24 and Articles 39, 40 and 61. Article 24 originally stated that court cases should be the province of constables, sheriffs, coroners and bailiffs, etc., not the Crown, whose proper function is the maintenance of the system of law as administered by the people themselves. This was altered from the original Latin to reverse that meaning, stating as it now does that the officers listed above are not to try cases which are properly the province of the Crown. This alteration was insidiously executed to enable the gradual assumption of legal authority by the Crown and its employees or appointees, a clear breach of the moral principle of self-governance by the people. The clear moral principle is that the Crown has no lawful authority to assume the role of prosecutor. That is purely the province of the putative claimant or victim of an alleged offence. The Crown's proper role is to ensure that the trial by jury system remains intact, which is the proven method of ensuring not only that the punishment of innocent people is minimised, but that legislation repugnant to the Constitution may be annulled at what we might call the street level, irrespective of the overbearing reaches of unlawfully inclined government officials. So the first principle is established ipso facto that individuals own themselves, and by extension everything that they produce by their own labours. Any legislation which offends either of those conditions is also ipso facto invalid or repugnant to natural or constitutional law. Yet, to reiterate, almost everyone accepts daily as conditions for living that some people claim to have the authority to dictate to other individuals not only what they may or may not do or say, but how they may dispose of their property. This is so obviously false and unrighteous that the question must be asked, how did this situation come about? Sadly, if we ask this question of most people, they basically shrug it off as just being the way things are. What can we do about it? I say sadly, but it is far worse than that. It is an indicator of a serious, possibly even fatal moral decrepitude. We've all heard the phrase, place in a preheated oven. But what exactly does that mean? As George Carlin points out, there are only two states for an oven to be in, heated or unheated. Preheated is a meaningless term. Human beings can exist only as free people or slaves. One is either totally free or at least partially enslaved to the whims of others. And what is partially enslaved? Isn't that, like preheated, a meaningless term? Either one is free or one is not. Any degree of slavery is still slavery. If one is willing to accept a level of slavery because one either doesn't understand the concept of freedom or doesn't want to defend it on principle, what is to prevent accepting a little more slavery, a little less freedom as time passes? The barons and the people in King John's time stood lawfully against him because his levels of extortion and other crimes were thoroughly excessive in their view, and Magna Carta was the result. There were immediate attempts to have Magna Carta dumped, not least initially by appealing to Pope Innocent III to have it annulled, using the allegation that even the authority which kings derived was ultimately from God. And who was God's representative on earth? Why, none other than the Pope. The attempt was thus to immediately nullify the Charter, and as a result, civil wars broke out, lasting for some time. Eventually, the general principles underlying Magna Carta held sway, so its opponents, who saw themselves as above the common people, set about a process of gradually vitiating its effects in everyday life. Getting rid of trial by jury was an early blow, largely achieved by 1270, when only landholders were allowed to sit on juries. Gradually, more impositions on individual liberties were introduced. Today, the levels of taxation we endure are even more onerous than those of King John. Bit by bit, little by little, people were gulled into accepting legislation which ignored or set aside the basic principle of the individual's ownership of self. Instead of the common law precepts mentioned at the start of this talk, people were nudged and manipulated into accepting the falsehood that precepts established under case law, which often evaded or negated those common law rights, was an acceptable template for the administration of justice. Justice, of course, as defined by those who are an integral part of the artificial structure being established over the centuries, and who are naturally therefore inclined to benefit from that structure at the expense of those who are not. Succeeding generations failed to push back against this system, with the result that now we can find ourselves being accosted by alleged law officers or other public servants, and having caused no harm to anyone, be ordered to travel as and where directed, or not to travel at all, or to pay to travel, or to pay for services which are part of the commons, like water or electricity. In Australia, these jumped-up apparatchiks even presume to command that we cast a vote in favour of some candidate for public office, even if we totally reject the claims of any of them to assume any degree of control over us. So much for freedom of conscience. Perhaps it will take a fall from our standards of living to make those of today commensurate with those which applied in King John's time, before enough people get outraged enough to get up on their hind legs and lawfully dissent against this current tyranny? One hopes not. Numerous remedies have been proposed by those who are awake to this lawless, fake government afflicting us. Sadly, many of these remedies fall into the trap of resorting to statute law, often masquerading as common law. But this is merely to grant legitimacy to treason and is asking to be railroaded. A friend of mine was recently forcibly detained by 3 police officers without being told he was under arrest or the existence of an arrest warrant. The current regime have complete disregard for habeas corpus or any of their own rules of honourable behaviour. What that means is that we should follow the law as laid down in Magna Carta Article 61 and simply swear or affirm our allegiance to that constitution and refuse entirely to engage with these criminal usurpers, apart from placing them on written notice of their crimes and our standing under law. That way they are compelled to either abandon their assaults on our rights or issue written orders or warrants which will stand as verifiable evidence in properly convened courts de jure at the times of their eventual trials for treason and sedition, etc. And this is the second most important factor to work on, the re-establishment or restoration of the trial by jury system. This is how the people control the law and the government. Search out and become familiar with this concept and support those movements pushing for it, with the proviso that they aren't trying to do this by incorporating any of the current corrupt system or its protagonists into their methods. That is all that is required for us to do. It's so simple. People ask me what I'm achieving by standing alone while they busily petition criminals to respect their rights. My reply is I'm not alone. That if only 10% of adult Crown subjects did as I'm doing, how long could the system keep going? Where are they going to imprison 10% of the adult population? Wouldn't trying to do that actually wake up a whole lot of the other 90% that something was seriously wrong? Might not many of those be also encouraged to stand for their freedom, do away with this tyranny, and recover lost freedoms for themselves and their children? Expediency has failed for 800 years. It's time now to stand on principle. Reduce every argument to the basic principle underlying it, and the answer to any question becomes as clear as day. Use the break to study the enlightening information on the websites listed on the links in the comments box. Enjoy your break, and let's come back with our loins girded, albeit in perhaps too many cases, for the first time. Thank you for watching.